We are talking about whether or not blended learning is disruptive. Now, you'll recall that we just talked about how if something is disruptive, we can make all sorts of predictions about the future based on identifying that pattern. So a lot of you are already doing blended learning in your schools or districts. Is that disruptive? Is blended learning just going to transform your schools? That's what we're going to talk about today. So to get there, I want to talk about a very different industry and tell you a story from a couple hundred years ago. And this story matters because a lot of times when a new disruptive technology emerges, the senior leaders or the executives in the incumbent industry and the incumbent organizations that are leading the industry, they recognize the disruptive technology and they're interested by it, but they don't know what to do with it. What they're doing right now is already kind of working, and it's scary to embark on something that's so new and to grab a technology that's not good enough yet for all of your purposes and to just figure out what to do with it. And so they look out their windows and they see this disruption coming, but they kind of scratch their heads and they don't know what to do with it. That is what happened about 200 years ago in the shipbuilding industry of all places. So we're going to journey back to that time. Now, I don't know very much about those tall ships, except for what I've seen in pirate movies. But I do recall that at one point, people were traveling on those big, tall ships with billowing sails to get across the mighty Atlantic Ocean. And that was the predominant means of travel for transoceanic voyages. And so in the day, I don't know who the major shipbuilders were, but there were some. There were some leading firms, and if we lived 200 years ago, we probably could have said, you know, it was Cadillac and whoever the names were of those shipbuilders. And those senior leaders, the executives at those shipbuilding companies, they saw the arrival of the steam engine. They weren't blind to it. They looked out their window. They saw that the steam engine had just been invented. It was just that they didn't know what to do with it, because they couldn't put the steam engine on their ship and really get across the ocean. They didn't, at the time it was so inefficient that the steam engine, it would have taken, they would have had to bring 3 ships along with them just to bring enough fuel to power that steam engine. Plus it was prone to explosion and fires. But they were intrigued by it. It clearly had some advantages. It would allow them to travel in the absence of wind, for example, which would have been nice on a sailing ship. And so the executives of those ship companies didn't know quite what to do. And they ended up saying, look, let's just do both. Let's put the steam engine on our sailing ships. And so in 1819, the first hybrid vessel, the SS Savannah, made the first transoceanic voyage across the Atlantic powered by a combination of sail and steam. Now, in fact, only 80 hours of the 600 and some odd number voyage where it's powered by steam, because mostly they needed those sails to get across. That steam engine was just not good enough. But I'm sure that for their customers, they were able to say, hey, come aboard the SS Savannah. If you look right there, it has both sails and steam. Not a bad deal. And so it was new and it was enticing, and maybe they got some more customers. Meanwhile, a very different story unfolded. And that was with some entrepreneurs who had the pure steam engine. And they said, where is there a market where the steam engine is already good enough? And they discovered one, and it was in the inland waterways, lakes and rivers market. So where people traditionally maybe went up and down the rivers on a barge or in a canoe, that steam engine was better than that. And so it got its start serving non-consumers. And it got its foothold there in the inland waterways market. That's where the pure play steam engine got its market. And then it got better and better over time, until by the early 1900s, that steam engine was good enough, in fact, to power a vessel all the way across the Atlantic. So you can imagine what happened then, right? Those shipbuilders that did the transoceanic voyages with the tall ships with the billowing sails were a little bit in trouble by then. Because by the time that steam engine in its pure form without any sails was able to get all the way across the Atlantic, then the market took off, it hit that inflection point on the S-curve, and you know the story of that disruptive innovation. Until today, we sadly do not have any of those classic shipbuilders of yore in our world at this moment. And that's the story of how that disruptive entrant found its foothold in a market where the technology was already good enough. It got better and better over time until wham, it displaced the established incumbent industry. So it really is a story of hybrids. What I want to focus on today is not this market, not the inland waterway market, but to think for a bit about that SS Savannah. What was going on there? It turns out that industry leaders and executives, when they see a disruptive technology emerge, they don't utterly ignore it, but they don't swap out what they've got for it either. What they do is they combine and say, maybe we can have a best of both worlds, a hybrid, where we take our existing technology, the sails, and combine it with the new, the steam, and we'll offer our customers the best of both worlds. That's a hybrid. So today I'm introducing to you the theory of hybrids and how in the early days of disruption, typically what you see in the incumbent sector is the evolution of a hybrid that marries the old with the new and offers it as a sustaining innovation, an innovation to sustain and improve upon the incumbent way of doing things. Meanwhile, there's this disruptive story happening on the edges, right? Let's look at another example. The automobile sector. What is America's hottest selling hybrid? I think it's in the automobile sector. It's the Prius. And it really came about because when the electric vehicle came about as an idea and that battery-operated vehicle was envisioned, it really wasn't good enough to say, here, let's just do pure electric vehicles. So companies like Toyota, whose customers said, hey, we're traveling up and down the highway. We need this thing to last for longer than a single battery life and a car can last. So a pure electric vehicle wouldn't do the trick for us. But a battery-operated vehicle, an electric vehicle combined with a gasoline one, now there's something interesting because you could maybe have more fuel efficiency combined with the traditional gasoline for the long hauls. And so that's what came about with Toyota's Prius, the classic hybrid automobile. Meanwhile, a different story is unfolding right now before our very eyes. There's a group of entrepreneurs who have said, for whom is the electric vehicle already good enough? Despite the fact that it can't accelerate very quickly, despite the fact that it needs to be recharged quite often, who might be okay with that? And they found two answers. The first, can you guess? Seniors in residential communities who actually were almost delighted by the fact that it couldn't accelerate very quickly, and they didn't really mind that that it needed to be recharged frequently, and they'd plug it in and they'd pop around their communities. And then the second, can you think of another? The parents of teenagers who were actually quite delighted that that car couldn't accelerate very quickly and couldn't go very far from home before it needed to be recharged. And in fact, there is a city outside of Atlanta where there are more than 1,000 high school kids darting around from home to school in these kind of electric carts today. That is a true story. And you actually see the sustaining innovation happening because they're starting to put some bling on those carts, you know, better fenders, better hubcaps, a little disco ball. You can see that sustaining innovation as it gets better and better among that set. Now, if I were in a different sector and were privy to the wherewithal to make a lot of financial bets, I would probably put my money on these pure plays. If someone were to ask me, where is the electric car going to take off, I'd put my money there because it's a disruptive entrant, and in disruptive battles, the entrants always win. I'd put my money there. And you can imagine over time that battery becoming better and better such that you no longer need the gasoline anymore. And these people will be in a good place for figuring that out. How do you spot a hybrid? It's a really interesting phenomenon that happens occasionally in our world. The first indication of a hybrid is that it tends to combine both the old and the new. It doesn't have just the steam engine on it. It has the sails and the steam engine. Second, it targets existing users, not just non-consumers. And so the Prius, for example, isn't just going after the seniors. It's going after people who are trying to go up and down. Does anyone here have a Prius? Yeah, you're trying to do more work, right, than just tote around a senior center, I would imagine. It tries to do the job of the incumbents. And so rather than saying, I'm going to try and maximize lower the cost so that a teenager could buy this. Instead, it says, I'm going to try to make your car just as fast and accelerate as quickly as before, plus be even more fuel efficient. And then fourth, it requires skill in both the old and the new. You can see that that's not always the case, but sometimes it is. So for example, in that SS Savannah, the ship, the sailors would have needed to know how to sail on a tall ship, plus deal with a steam engine. So it required a little bit of sophistication with both types of technology. That's how you spot a hybrid. So if you think about those rules of thumb right now, we're going to shift gears and we're going to start talking about blended learning. Remember our original question, is blended learning disruptive? Is it more like those pure play disruptions? Or is it more like sustaining innovation? Or a hybrid. A hybrid is an example, one type of sustaining innovation where it has the old plus some of the new on it to give it a jolly good ride. And what we've discovered is that the answer is a little bit of both. So you'll recall this diagram perhaps from the pre-work course, this diagram of the different models of blended learning. And the answer is that we have to look within that to find the answer. What we've identified is that some of the models of blended learning appear to be hybrids. In fact, oftentimes when you hear about a station rotation, a lab rotation, or a flipped classroom, you'll hear it marketed as it's the best of both worlds. You have the face-to-face teacher in the room, you have all of the traditional instruction, plus you have data-based instruction because you have all the data coming out of the station rotation or whatever it is. And so it's really the best of both worlds. Meanwhile, the models on the right, we would identify as the disruptive zone. They appear to have more of this, the traits of a disruptive innovation. Let's dig into that a little bit and see why that's the case. So for those on the left, how do we know they have a little bit of the old? Well, typically you walk into a station rotation and it still kind of looks like a traditional classroom. Oftentimes there's still a teacher, there's still a front of the room, there's a chalkboard, and you'll see a lot of the things that are still typically happening, but they've added an online component. That's particularly true at the elementary school level, where we've even been dealing with centers and stations for a long time, and now added an online station to bring out those opportunities. And so that's one way to identify that it's a hybrid, is it has some of the old and the new. Whereas in the disruptive zone, the rule of thumb, more or less, for identifying a disruptive model of blended learning is that oftentimes you can't even tell where the front of the room is at all. Oftentimes they knock down the walls. In fact, I would much prefer to do a flex model in this kind of a room than in a traditional classroom. Because you've seen, we need the space, we need the flexibility. And so oftentimes, really most of the signifiers of the traditional are gone completely. And you have more of a pure play with those models on the right. So when you think disruptive innovation combined with blended learning, think flex model, think enriched virtual, think individual rotation, think a la carte. When we're talking about disruptive innovation as it applies to blended learning, I'm typically not talking about a station rotation or a flex or a lab rotation or a flipped classroom. Okay, so with that in mind, what are the implications for us? How does this apply to real life? The first recommendation, use those hybrid models, the models in the hybrid zone, to improve our traditional classrooms. Just because it's a sustaining innovation does not mean it's bad. In fact, sustaining innovation is crucial for a vital education sector. So as you think about models like a station rotation, those are great places to improve our traditional classrooms. We're going to have them for a long time to come, and my hope is that all the classrooms in America would at least become hybrids. At least become like a Prius, where you take the benefits of online learning and allow more small group instruction, more data-based instruction, more individual coaching, and all of the things that those flipped classroom, station rotation, and lab rotation models can give us. Meanwhile, use disruptive models to solve non-consumption problems. We all know that in education we've had too many non-consumption problems for too long. Too many places where there isn't a solution for credit recovery, where there is no access to computer coding courses, where there is no access to AP physics, whatever it is. Those are great places to look for a disruptive model of blended learning to finally help us solve the problem. And the second reason to pay attention to the disruptive models and to not only be sustaining innovators is because over time we know that disruptive entrants tend to replace the incumbent system completely. And we can make that same prediction that the SS Savannah that eventually ran aground and was never seen again, we can make that same prediction to some extent for our high school classrooms. That over time, those disruptive entrants have enough footholds in non-consumption, there's enough non-consumption happening at the high school level that we can predict that over time, our high schools will look very different. We will still have high schools, but they will be replaced with disruptive models. And meanwhile, at the elementary school level, we'll probably mostly be seeing sustaining innovation. We don't think that elementary schools classrooms will be largely disrupted by the models like Flex, just because there's not as much non-consumption at the elementary school level. But at the middle school level and at the high school level, we'll see really a change at what the inside of our schools looks like and feels like over time. And so for those innovators who are thoughtful about that, you can do a better job of strategic planning and making sure that you get good at those disruptive models so that you're ready as they become more and more of a thing. And the parents are saying, hey, why is my student not learning that really engaging Flex studio that you have set up? You'll know how to solve that problem. Winning with theory. That was the name of this module. Why? Because we don't have to have so much guesswork when it comes to innovating in education. In fact, there are theories that can help illuminate the path forward, that can help us identify that over time our schools will change. And we can do better at taking the guesswork out of our innovations, especially when we're innovating for children. And be more intentional by looking out that window and identifying where are we being sustaining innovators, where are we being disruptive innovators, and why. And secondly, I want to suggest to you that you think about a two-part strategy. One, look at your core problems. Where are your traditional classrooms serving mainstream students just not getting the performance you need enough? That is a great place to match with the hybrid models. And secondly, as you're thinking about your strategic planning, where are there areas of non-consumption? Who are we not serving? Where are there professional development opportunities that we're missing? So all along the ladder, where are there places where there are gaps? And that's a great place to finally have an opportunity to serve by bringing in a disruptive model. So those are some theory thoughts that will help guide your efforts with innovation so that you can channel them to your highest quality potential. With that, please find a comfortable place and do the check for understanding. I'm going to give you 5 minutes.